So this video picks up where the last one left off and continues with the necessary and sufficient conditions for democracy, as I've described in the Cooperative Economy towards a stakeholder-led democracy. And we left off, just to remind the viewers, last video with issues of what are necessary and sufficient, and the necessary and sufficient conditions. And now I get into the actual content with regards to democracy. So as I argue, the first necessary condition for democracy, and again, these are conditions, again, the probability that event Y, in this case, democracy, would not have occurred in the absence of event X, given that X and Y in effect did occur. So again, communication is one of the most important achievements, of course, of one of social institutions in being able to meet the needs of members. And in order to achieve this end requires communication, which involves both the making and executing of plans. Cockshott and co-authors observe that if by collective labor civilized humans can put up structures more complex than bees, it is because they can read, write, and draw. A plan, whether on paper or as in earlier epochs scribed on stone, coordinates the individual efforts of many humans into a collective effort. Moreover, what is really unique to humans here is first the social division of labor between the labor of conception by the architects, argue Cockshott and authors, and the work of execution by the builders, and second, the existence of materialized plans, configurations of matter that can control and direct the labor of groups of humans. So they say, while insect societies may have a division of labor between castes, for example, between worker and soldier termites, they do not have a comparable division between conception and execution, between issuers and followers of orders, nor do insects have technologies of record and writing. They can communicate with each other. Dancing bees describe to others the whereabouts of flowers. Walking ants leave scent trails for their companions. These messages, like human speech, coordinate labor. Like our tales, they vanish in the telling. But not restricted to telling tales, we can make records that persist, communicated over space and time. This implies that human communication, different from other forms, is cumulative, allowing subsequent generations to learn from the mistakes of prior ones and persistent, outlasting individual contexts. Lastly, the authors emphasize that the set of messages can be expressed in our language is exponentially greater than the language of bees. So again, democracy requires communication for it to occur. The second necessary condition is cooperation. Cooperation is one of the, if not the most important behavioral antecedent to democracy, as we saw in the discussion of macrocultures. But of course, as the prior discussion has also shown, cooperation does not necessarily occur in non-coercive ways. So it does occur in non-coercive ways, and it does also occur in coercive ways. So we also learned in the prior discussion that it is clearly incorrect to simply assume the existence of a propensity to cooperate, and that one must be constantly attuned to both willingness, ability, and opportunities for cooperation. On the other hand, many make the mistake of treating cooperation as an incidental factor, an afterthought. Historically, for instance, as I discussed in the last lecture, game theory has worked with the prisoner's dilemma as the benchmark model of social interaction. However, it is clear that this model's focus on individual non-cooperative agents and utility maximizing strategic interaction is wholly unsuited to describe a discursive, dynamic, and polycontextual approach in cooperation. That is to say, in its striving for universality, traditional, in particular, non-evolutionary game theory appears unsuitable to describe all but the most elementary rational organisms. Indeed, cooperation is possible in non-cooperative situations, then with reference to credible threats and other forms of coercion. These forms of coercion require considerable costs, however, including monitoring, and may not ultimately be sustainable. The much more interesting and meaningful question regards the ability to sustain cooperation in fundamentally dynamic, communicative scenarios. As Aumann tells us, in order to represent this type of cooperation, we must shift from the act rationality of utility maximization to rule rationality. This type of rationality is generated in line is generally, in line with what Herbert Simon referred to as satisficing. And indeed, the necessity of cooperation for democratic choice to occur is clear. Without some form of cooperation, only the world Machiavelli painted in Il Principe, the Prince, is possible, in which fear governs. Fear requires authority, and rather, cooperation requires authority and not necessarily power, which fear implies. As Philip de Boot argues, power is the ability to constrain, authority is the ability to convince. A macroculture of cooperation, therefore, is needed for democracy to occur. Thirdly is autonomy. The current discussion seeks to fill the research gap by developing a typology of democratic cooperative structures, governance structures in particular. In order to do so, we must have a more clearly explicit understanding of the theoretical mechanisms by which the connection between democracy and autonomy can be manifested. I do argue that the connection is on many levels, and particular on the level of agency. In particular, autonomous agency, commonly referred to as responsibility. That act, as Wollaston argued in 1759, which may be denominated morally good or evil, must be the act of being capable of distinguishing, choosing, and acting for himself, or more briefly, an intelligent or free agent, because in proper speaking, no act at all can be ascribed to that which is not imbued with these capacities. For that which cannot distinguish cannot choose, and that which has not the opportunity or liberty of choosing for itself and acting accordingly from an internal principle acts at all under a necessity incumbent ab extra. But that which acts thus is in reality only an instrument in the hand of something which imposes the necessity, and cannot properly be said to act, but only to be acted. The act must be the act of an agent, therefore not of his instrument. And as John Milton also suggested and put into the mouth of Lucifer in his Paradise Lost, it is better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. The universal Turing machine as a concept emphasizes the connection between the ability to imagine counterfactuals as a fundamental human quality that necessitates granting a degree of non-instrumental autonomy. And of course, similar observations were made one generation ago, as mentioned by Albert Bandura. To return to Bandura's work on social learning, he wrote that the apparent divergence of theory and practice is reconciled by recognizing that change is mediated through cognitive processes, but the cognitive events are induced and altered most readily by experiences of mastery arising from successful performance. Bandura focuses attention on the concept of self-efficacy, which he distinguishes from an outcome. The two notions are distinct, he argues, because on the one hand, an outcome expectancy is defined as a person's estimate that a given behavior will lead to a certain outcome, whereas an efficacy expectation is the conviction that one can successfully execute the behavior required to produce the outcome, regardless of the actual outcome. For Bandura, outcome and efficacy expectations are differentiated because individuals can come to believe that a particular course of action will produce certain outcomes, but question whether they can perform these actions. Thus, perceived self-efficacy does not only reduce anticipatory fears and inhibitions, but through expectations of eventual success, it affects coping efforts once they are initiated. Efficacy expectations determine how much effort people will expend and how long they will persist in the face of obstacles and aversive experiences. The stronger the efficacy or mastery expectations, the more active the efforts. Thus, Bandura underlines the recursive process of social learning that autonomy instills. Those who persist in performing activities that are subjectively threatening but relatively safe objectively will gain corrective experiences that further reinforce their sense of efficacy, thereby eventually eliminating their fears and defensive behavior. Those who give up prematurely will retain their self-debilitating expectations and fears for a long time. This notion of self-efficacy, of course, is related to similar concepts like that by Abraham Maslow of self-actualization, which I've discussed in Module 1, as well as the efforts by Amartya Sen discussing capabilities and his capabilities approach, as well as Carol Pateman's notion of the spillover thesis. in her 1970 work on workplace democracy. Should also say that this relates to the distinction between translatio and concessio as an effort to delegate authority. In this relation, Armin Falk and Nora Setch entrusted the University of Bonn students with the care of their own healthy young mouse, showing each a picture of one of the very cute mice. They then offered them a payment if they would allow the mouse to be gassed to death. Before making their decision, the subjects were shown a very disturbing video of a mouse being gassed. In addition to this individual treatment, they also implemented a market treatment in which the subject could sell her mouse to another student who would then allow the mouse to be killed. They hypothesized that a student who was reluctant to surrender her mouse as simply an individual choice might be more willing to let the mouse die in the market treatment because the sale to another student distanced her from the deed. 46% of the subjects in the individual non-market treatment were willing to surrender their mice for 10 euros or less. When the mouse trustee could sell the mouse to a buyer, however, 72% were willing to let their mouse die for that price or less. So this, again, delegation, translatio, often leads to a reduction in what Adam Smith termed the principle of sympathy. It renders the interaction more abstract, complex, and less prone to ethical codetermination. This is in itself a normative argument for framing organizational decisions in terms of concessio rather than translatio, as the affected individuals are more likely to take a non-instrumental view on the various decision factors before them. I should also make a point about the relation between autonomy and imagination. Here, the question is posed whether there is an essential relationship between feelings of control and imagination. At first glance, this theory would contradict our prior exposition of constraint theory in the prior video, which specifically locates creativity within the restriction of the domain of agency. I remind the viewer of this notion of choice of constraints versus choice under constraints. However, we should distinguish between control and freedom in the abstract. Just as hypothetically limitless daydreaming is seldom associated with significant artistic output, the relationship between control and imagination is not one of linear increase. In fact, there is a nonlinear relation between processes promoting self-efficacy and imagination. Thus, as Elster argues, daydreams have a shortage of scarcity, and that makes them intrinsically unsatisfactory, a situation Thomas Schelling attributes to the fact that they have no suspense, no surprise, and no danger. Individuals must feel recognition for the tasks they take, the risks they take, and even more so for the achievements they make, else they will not partake in imaginative or risky activity. Thus, the adage, no risk, no reward, can in fact be turned on its head. If people don't feel they will be rewarded, they will not engage in risky, i.e., imaginative activity. Castoriadis also found the correlation between democracy and speculative philosophy to be significant. He remarks, for instance, on Herodotus' self-deprecating attitude in his histories towards his own culture when confronted with the cases where the other simply outperforms the Greeks. It is this detached speculation and curiosity regarding a malleable nature, natura naturans, as we referred to it in a prior video, that for Castoriadis distinguished the Greeks from their contemporaries. Thus, he speaks of both the creation of a public space and a public time, which promoted both individual citizens' feeling of control over their fate and created the opportunity to develop the imagination. Another necessary condition for democracy is a functioning economy of esteem. Now, George Brennan and Philip Petit have written a book on the economy of esteem, and I appropriate that term. And just to activate that term or manifest it in an example, I again quote from Pericles' funeral oration. He says that our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. Our government does not copy our neighbors, but it is an example to them. It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not in the few. But while there exists equal justice to all and alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized, and when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. Neither is poverty, says Pericles, an obstacle, but a man may benefit his country whatever his obscurity of his condition. There is no exclusiveness in our public life, and in our private business we are not suspicious of one another, nor angry with our neighbor if he does what he likes. So again, this is an example of the functioning economy of esteem, which suggests that it is irrelevant what the individual's caste or social class is as to their merit. So meritocracy is a very important aspect of a functioning economy of esteem. And of course, as Brennan and Petit suggest, one cannot simply go into the store and buy esteem. So there is a very complex uh, set of paraphernalia, including social institutions that bestow esteem on others, such as prizes and recognition of exceptional and outstanding behavior, or intellectual, academic, or political achievement, and so on. The next necessary condition is, and a very important one, is trust. Trust is, in fact, one of the most important value antecedents to democracy, including organizational democracy, as a system of broad and popular government requires a high degree of trust in one's fellow citizens. Moreover, in order for communication and non-coercive cooperation to occur, what Oliver Williamson calls consummate cooperation, stakeholders must be able to rely on informal or implicit contracts. As Emile Durkheim remarked a century ago, most of what we label contracts occurs external to what formal contracts stipulate and requires a high degree of trust. Moreover, Mark Granovetter has also established that in practice, firms base most of their relations with suppliers and other external stakeholders like clients, not on contracts, but on long-term relationships of trust. Organizational stakeholders, like citizens, need to be able to trust their leaders. The 12th book of Homer's Odyssey begins with the crew's encounter with the sirens near the island of Ios. Kirke warns Odysseus that he should have his crew fill their ears with soft beeswax, and advises him that he may hear the beautiful song, but that his crew must bind him, and if he asks to be unbound, let his crew bind him all the tighter. A typical lesson drawn from this episode, as seen in Adorno's contribution to the dialectic of enlightenment, is the restrictions that must accompany the special privileges of leadership. If leaders aren't bound by those they lead, by rules, sanctions, limits to power, discursive elements of accountability, and so on, they very quickly befall the temptations of arbitrary rule and lose the trust of those they are supposed to govern. Now, I move on actually to the sufficient conditions. This, of course, is Kohlberg, a famed developmental psychologist on the right. And that brings me actually to the very first and most important sufficient condition for democracy. And just to remind the viewer that the most important aspect of a sufficient rather condition is that it measures the capacity for X to produce Y, uh, given that X and Y are in fact absent. So the reason that um, moral competence is so important for this development of democracy can be seen again in the work of developmental psychologists like Kohlberg on the right here, also Lev Vygotsky and Piaget, and others who have all demonstrated that the eliciting of behavior in line with norm rationality requires a certain socialization process. People are neither born as a tabula rasa, nor are they pre-configured to meet the certain requirements of a particular society. In particular, while individuals may be endowed from birth with the necessary pre-adaptations for democratic thought and practice, they aren't born, so to speak, democratic, and need to experience the elements discussed in the prior discussion, the necessary conditions, extensively and intensively in order to judge for themselves right action. In recent decades, psychologist Georg Lind has introduced an entire conceptual apparatus around the term moral competence, including his Constance method of dilemma discussion. Lind has claimed that moral competence is an important, perhaps even the most important requirement for democratic coexistence. Moreover, this notion of moral competence can be considered a key qualification in many areas of life, which is at least as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is particularly the case in dilemmas. So Lind suggests the case of an accountant as an example. The way in which dilemmas are of importance is for everyone to see for them, can see for themselves, of enormous importance for our behavior in the family, in all social relationships, at work, at school, and in public life. And again, the accountant is seen as a practical manifestation of the difficult situations moral dilemmas pose in practice. Firms want their accountants to maximize their profits, but also to respect the legal constraints. They want to utilize all the tricks for saving revenues, but also want to be considered honest. Besides, accountants are confronted with their own dilemmas. They want to make a sufficient income that supports them and their families and protects them against future poverty, but also stay out of trouble. They need to be loyal to their employers and do a good job, but also to report errors and rule breaking of their firm. And of course, Lind has developed the entire Constance method of dilemma discussion to develop dynamic tools for increasing moral competence and for measuring it, which are very important. The second sufficient condition is transparency. Kyriasis attempts to view governing systems according to principles outlined by Claude Shannon. In a 1948 paper, Shannon defined information as a well-defined and above all measurable quantity. This definition describes precisely how much information can be communicated between different elements of a system. It cannot be stressed how significant Shannon's findings were, and it has been suggested that Shannon's theory ranks alongside those of Darwin, Wallace, Newton, and Einstein. According to Shannon, information refers to the smallest irreducible way to communicate a particular phenomenon, like a series of numbers. Kyriasis adapts Shannon's notion, which itself is related to Boltzmann's equation, in order to develop an energy conception of political power, the most important characteristic of which is the concentration of political power. This is represented by putting the number of power carriers in relation to the total population, which represents the power concentration in the representatives. I do refer to this term as O, referring to oligarchization. This terminology is a very useful means of measuring actual power in differing forms of government. One can, for instance, infer that monarchies would have a rather high O value given for instance, by a factor of 1 million in the case where there is a population of 1 million and a single monarch. In this case, O equals 1 million. On the other hand, a democracy would see a much lower level of O. For example, a city like Athens had around 25,000 citizens among a population of around 400,000, meaning that O would be divided, 400,000 divided by 25,000 would be equal to 16. It is easy to see that, for instance, if we were dealing with a firm with 5,000 workers, 500 of which are member owners, we would have a level of concentration of 5,000 divided by 500 of 10. I return to this topic again when I get into the issue of accountability as a democratic value. The next sufficient condition is monitoring. In addition to transparency, democracy is additionally impossible without a high degree of mutual monitoring. As Axelrod writes, for a nice strategy to be stable in the collective sense, it must be provocable. Thus, he concludes that mutual cooperation can emerge in a world of egoists without central control by starting with a cluster of individuals who rely on reciprocity. Again, this is another way of talking about the rise of macrocultures, as I've described in a prior video. To remind the reader of the discussion in prior videos, we derived that cooperation has both benefits and costs. It is clear that such costs can be borne by single individuals in a top-down form of cooperation, such as the classical industrial firm that Karl Marx and others described, or they can be borne by a broader array of stakeholders cooperating in reciprocally beneficial ways, bottom up. It is arguable that monitoring costs in the latter case are reduced. In this vein, in a path-breaking paper, Bowles and Gintis discuss mutual monitoring as an advantage of worker-owned enterprises. Looking at a situation in a traditional enterprise employing a contingent enforcement approach, the authors argue that in a world of asymmetric information and credit-constrained agents, optimal, i.e. contingent enforcement contracting, where the distribution of fixed wages depends on the worker carrying out a particular action, cannot replace systems of endogenous enforcement. This is because contingent renewal enforcement strategies involve two components: resource use monitoring inputs such as surveillance personnel and equipment, and non-resource using distributive payments such as enforcement rents. Both are costly to the enforcer. Thus, a firm like Amazon spends a great deal of money supervising and surveilling its employees' activities, money that could have been spent, for instance, educating or training the workforce, improving local infrastructure, and similar circumstances. Moreover, I should mention a recent paper by Nathalie Magne and Donald Kruse, which has shown that, in fact, particularly in the knowledge economy, worker cooperatives are often more productive than traditional firms, likely due to this mutual monitoring benefit. Back to Bowles and Gintis, the authors argue that placing workers in control of the monitoring structure, in addition to changing their status from fixed to residual claimants, provides a powerful incentive for them to cooperate with the monitoring system in enforcing a high level of effort by one's fellow workers, and may take advantage of the private information held by workers about the work activities of their workmates. Thus, mutual monitoring is not only a necessary requirement for cooperation and democracy to occur, it is actually an efficiency-enhancing reform over and against a contested scenario. Robert Owen's experiences in treating employees as partners had similar effects by increasing productivity that actually increased profitability. Experiences of firms that have successfully converted to employee ownership, such as VME Cooperative, have reported similar experiences. The next sufficient condition is sanctioning. Sanctioning is an empirically and historically apparent part of cooperation. Theoretically, we argued above, or in the prior videos, for viewing cooperation as a necessary condition for democracy. Historically, we saw in the prior module, this would be module 2, that all democratic societies featured various types of sanctioning devices, whether ostracism and the graphe paranomon in Athens, the penitentiaries and shunning around Quakers, or similar phenomena among the Haudenosaunee. Sanctioning can impact both norm-based and act-based rationality. It is therefore important to design sanctioning policies to be fair, transparent, and flexible. One example is ostracism. Not only in Greece, but virtually every democratic polity uses some form of ostracism. However, drawing from Ostrom's observation that the benefits of self-organization are the ability to implement graded sanctions and, on occasion, consider the context of a scenario, one of the most important challenges to sanctioning is to know when not to sanction. Facilitating a bottom-up governance structure increases the likelihood that tacit knowledge and context is incorporated into any possible punishment. In theory, juries are designed to feature such bottom-up approach. The last sufficient condition is legitimacy. Contrary to the game theoretic predictions, Gut and others' results indicated that choices made positive choosers in an ultimatum game made positive offers, and that the modal offer was close to an equal split division. In addition, the acceptance behavior of receivers in this ultimatum game was also at odds with the theory that in positive but small offers tended to be rejected, despite the theory's prediction of acceptance. Good and all others interpreted these data as suggesting that experimental choosers might form their choice of the correct offer by employing some notions of equity, which are at odds with the rationality of backward induction, while receivers reject offers that offend their basic sense of fairness. The last discussion that I wanted to get into here is the notion of democracy and democratic values. Now, these could be considered the necessary and sufficient conditions, although I have not labeled them as such. These are inclusion, equity, and accountability. The first of these, inclusion, can be referred to on the basis of Pericles' famous quote that democracy is just because it allows the many to govern. Thus, a progressive value of inclusion rather obviously lies at the center of democracy. Whether in the form of the Athenian bull, the Roman plebeian councils, the assemblies of northern Italian popular republics, or of the Swiss cantons, in the indigenous critique of European absolutism, the Haitian Revolution, and so on. Certain strands of the European liberal tradition, the Chartist movement, the movements of 1848, the Paris Commune, and so on and so forth, each of these democratic traditions places at its center two principles. the natural rights of human beings as citizens, and the self-determination of at least the majority of those citizens and their sovereignty over laws, customs, and practices. Thus, democracy is always a practice of concessio, not of translatio. As we saw in the example of Greece in Module 2, the question of who are the members is a significant one. Following Aristotle's utilitarian argument for slavery, which suggested that slavery was only necessary as long as tools did not move themselves, one must ask whom the privilege or right of development of personality, to whom it is accessible of their personality. Since the era of the Reformation, the notion of the inviolability and inalienability of conscience has driven the idea of individual freedom and equality of human beings, a development that was further promoted during the encounter with the indigenous critique during the Enlightenment. Thus, in keeping with the progressive vision of democracy outlined in prior discussions, I state that an axiom which is to be analyzed in further detail, that membership should be extended as far as possible. Thus, taking Sacchetti and Bozaga's total cost model, dividing the cost of membership and rearranging the subsequent equation, substituting the second term, we get the ratio of exclusion, which I have on the on the left here, which gives the relative share of exclusion costs to membership costs. If we recall the observation that costs of exclusion can be interpreted inversely as the benefits of inclusion, and an analog to the cooperative rent introduced in a prior video and represented as the CR, then we can rewrite the equation as the ratio of inclusion. This is the last equation on the left, which shows the costs of exclusion relative to the costs, rather the cooperative rent relative to the costs of membership. This general indicator can be filled up with both decreased costs and benefits, such as the increased value anticipated by the take-up of a particular member with respect to the numerator, including factors like the increased likelihood of mutual monitoring, intrinsic motivation, and self-efficacy. On the other hand, the costs in the denominator include wage and or salary rates and training costs. What becomes clear from the relation is that firms that focus more fully on informal contracts will, on average, have lower costs of membership. At the same time, quantifying the anticipated value creation of their additional members is more difficult and necessarily takes up on a stochastic nature. Thus, relational governance reduces the cost of acquiring new members in governance and at the same time renders the estimation of their benefits more challenging. This is likely to be due to the fact that notions like shared value creation place emphasis on discursive notions of valuation and so forego explicitly instrumental indicators like quarterly profit. Here again, we see the benefits and costs of bottom-up forms of cooperation. Excuse me. The second democratic value, equity, refers both to what the Greeks referred to as isogoria, the right to have the law applied equally to all, and isonomia. Rather, I've confused them. There's isonomia, the right to have the law applied equally to all, and isogoria, the right to speak their mind freely and without fear of retribution. So freedom of speech and assembly and habeas corpus is what we would refer to in modern words. Thus, while the value of inclusion involves the translation of relational perspectives into an organization's cost-benefit calculation, equity involves the equal application of laws, duties, and privileges. Thus, it is inextricably tied to the next value of accountability that I introduce in a moment, but it is separate from it in as far as equity is an internal value, whereas accountability can also be an external value. One further social application of the type 1 and type 2 error in statistical thinking can be applied to tort law, as does David Ehrlichman in a recent work. The principle of equity, isonomia, should apply not only to interpersonal applications of the law, but also to interpersonal ones, such as an individual should not be considered a subject of the law in one setting and an object in another. Thus, a typical case of tort where an employee is considered responsible for a criminous act, but under normal circumstances is considered an external labor supplier whose ability to responsibly act is reassigned to the employer, is clearly such an example. And clearly, such a situation violates the principle of equity. Reiterating the conclusions of prior modules, the employee must be considered a person in both instances, and this must be reflected in the labor contract. Thus, we derive the equity indicator, which is an instrument to translate the above reasoning into an organizational logic in the following way. Uh, the equity indicator gives the rate of representation of employees in an organization's membership. As you can see in the top equation on the left side, where the sum of employees is divided by the sum of membership. In the second formulation, there's in fact a flexible terminology where the equity indicator can be applied to any class of stakeholders. And here there's a sum of X divided by the sum of the members. For instance, in the case of platform enterprises, it may be useful to consider the equity of users of the platform. So this equation would be reformulated as the sum of users divided by the sum of members. Lastly, accountability is a democratic value that is instrumental in that it is the result of interventions in the mechanisms employed in governance. This is what renders it methodological rather than epistemic value. At the same time as observed in other direction, accountability ensures that grievances are actually redressed. As Andrew Bandura points out, awareness alone is a weak countervalence. Most people are quite aware that advertisers attempt to influence their behavior by exaggerated claims, model testimonials, pseudo experiments, demonstrating the superiority of their products, paired association of events, and portrayal of benefits accruing to product users. You think of toothpaste advertisements as an example. Such knowledge does not make, argues Bandura, people immune to advertising influences. The same is true of persuasion through response consequences. Coercion can extract compliance, and rewards can induce accommodating behavior, even though people recognize that incentives are prompting their reactions and actions. The discussion on transparency is also related to the democratic value of accountability. As I have said, I would return to this topic. Just as a high O value of oligarchization means a restriction of information flow to a small circle of individuals, it also means a lack of accountability. Thus, we see a low O value in democratic governance is accountable to the citizens. Meanwhile, in the oligarchic government depicted in the monarchic example I described earlier, the power carriers stand above the laws. As the information flow essential for governing is concentrated in the oligarchy in the restricted set of optimates, and in the monarchy in the monarch and his or her court, there is a lack of accountability. In conclusion, Cornelius Castoriadis discusses in his assessment of the fall of Athens the defeat in the Peloponnesian War as having resulted from the hubris of the Athenians. Hubris does not simply presuppose freedom, but the absence of fixed norms, argues Castoriadis. The fundamental ambiguity of the ultimate orientation points of our actions. Breaking the law is not hubris, but a concrete and limited crime. Hubris occurs where self-restraint is the only norm, that is, where boundaries are crossed that are nowhere defined. I put forth the argument that the risk of hubris increases in as far as the O value, oligarchization, increases, and the values, for instance, of inclusion and equity decrease. It would seem reasonable to assume, moreover, that these values are not independent of each other, such that they exist as a system of cybernetic couplings or triads. To conclude, as Kyriasis and Metaxas argue, the extension of military service and the associated emerging value system were preconditions for the emergence of ancient direct democracy. This, of course, required a society of particular size and scale. Authors like Moses Finley have already commented on the necessary relations between grain imports and the maintenance of Athenian democracy. Moreover, Kyriasis and Metaxas continue that the role of scale is a point recognized already by Aristotle, who wrote, when, however, states began to increase in size and infantry forces acquired a greater degree of strength, more persons were admitted to the enjoyment of political rights. And this argument was taken over by Max Weber, who suggested that the decisive criterion for voting right in the assembly was initially the capacity to equip oneself for service in the hoplite infantry. Thus, I've argued in this discussion on democratic collective choice that the traditional economics literature on cooperation and democratization, exemplified by Acemoglu and Robinson, is analytically incorrect, that the correct approach is to turn this issue on its chronological head, looking at cooperation as the explanatory variable for the development of trust and other necessary conditions for democracy, and ultimately the sufficient elements such as moral competence, transparency, and legitimacy. Ultimately, as I have argued, this causal arrow can be seen reflected in the democratic values of inclusion, equity, and accountability. In the next video, I continue with issues related to the what I call cooperative microeconomics, looking at firms as anticipatory systems, and then I move into looking at cooperatives and cooperative values as elements of anticipation. So looking forward to